Welcome back to Spearman Studios, where this week we have a little bit something different. Hey, Homer, why don't you tell us what we are talking about this week?
Spider Pig, does whatever a Spider Pig does.
Homer,
Can he swing
why do you have a
from
pig?
web? No, we can't. He's
Homer,
a pig.
Homer,
Look
please put that pig down.
out, he
Put
is a
the
Spider
pig down, or it will become
Pig
bacon in my
does
mouth.
whatever a Spider Pig does. Can he swing?
Look, I don't care
from
what
a
you
web?
say, Homer.
No, we can't.
That's not
He's
a spider pig,
Look
okay? There is no such
out,
thing
he is
as a spider pig. I mean, I stand corrected. As you may have noticed, I am wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt. Why? Because this week is Spider Week, and this week we are going to be discussing all 5 films of the Spider-Man pentilogy, if you want to call it that. I don't really consider the Amazing Spider-Man movies to be sequels. They're just, again, a reboot, like most other movies nowadays. And with the upcoming release of Spider-Man Homecoming and a possible return to form for the classic character that I grew up watching and loving, it should be fairly interesting to see how the Marvel Cinematic Universe really portrays my favorite character. And going from what I saw in Civil War, it pretty much is going to be one of my favorite depictions of Peter Parker and Spider-Man all rolled into one. But where did Spider-Man start off? Well, Spider-Man started off as a comic book by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, as a way of making a superhero that is more kind of on the level of high school kids, and has since garnered to be one of the iconic flagship characters of Marvel Comics. Now, DC Comics has a whole pantheon full of iconic characters, but if you were to ask any Marvel fan today who the iconic flagship character is besides Stan Lee, would be Spider-Man. Spider-Man has been around for decades, and it took a while for the character to be on the big screen in 2002. Now, Spider-Man 2002 is kind of a rough story for some people because this movie came out after a time of tragedy in the United States of America, and I don't think we can go about really reviewing this movie without bringing the context in of how important this movie is to the American conscience, as this film, well, had this to show.
Clint, shut her down.
Have a good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. Get your head down! Get your head down! It'll all be over in about 30 seconds. Go, 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 go! Clear! Okay, go, come on! Go, 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 go! Woo! Like candy from a baby. Yeah! Sit back and enjoy the ride.
You saw that right. It's the Twin Towers, and this movie came out 1 year after the 9/11 incident. So it was kind of jarring for some people to watch that advertisement and say, hey, the Twin Towers aren't there anymore. But fortunately enough, they pulled it and continued to show more Spider-Man stuff to get people more interested. And I would go more into detail about how this movie affected the American conscience at the time when this film was released, but there's already someone else who has made that video, so I will link that video in the description down below. So, let's start off with Spider Week with Spider-Man 2002. Directed by Sam Raimi, it is one of the first attempts at making a Spider-Man movie ever. If you thought Wonder Woman, the first time having her get a movie, is so groundbreaking, try Spider-Man. I mean, like, pretty much with any other hero. I mean, Spider-Man is one of the goofiest characters ever. I mean, he swings around on a web, he has spider sense, and Wonder Woman is a warrior, which is not hard to make a movie out of, and I was kind of surprised that it took so long to make it. But Spider-Man 2002 is one of those oddity-type movies. Now, this movie was directed by Sam Raimi, who at the time was known for the Evil Dead movies. Which is kind of an odd sort of thing, right? There's this sort of histories with superhero films where they get the oddest of choices to make their films, and yet they turn out to be good. Like, remember back when Batman was released? Granted, I wasn't alive then, but remember back then, there were people that were lambasting the casting choices of Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne and Batman. And guess what? He's become a staple of the franchise. Michael Keaton is a Batman in many of pop culture's minds, and Jack Nicholson is regarded as one of the best Jokers. But does that pay the same way for Peter Parker in Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire? Okay, well, let's get into the story. The story follows Peter Parker, a sort of a dweeb and a nerd in New York. Pretty much the standard sort of like geek to hero type story, right? Well, on a class trip to a science facility that studies spiders, not a radioactive facility like in the comics, but a genetic lab, Peter is bitten by a spider that is genetically modified from many different types of spiders. Now, already you get the similar type of story, but it's a little bit different in the way they tell it, and it's really well done and well put. At the same time, Norman Osborn, played by Willem Dafoe, the great and lordly Willem Dafoe, has been getting a little bit of trouble with the United States military. See, the United States military wants to have Norman Osborn develop this superhuman powder gas thing for their soldiers, and Norman Osborn is facing a possible defunding from the military for that project. And so, well, he has to go back to formula in a certain way. And at the same time, again, we also get the mutation of Peter Parker and his origin story of how he becomes Spider-Man. And at the same time, we also get the origin story of Green Goblin. And from there, we get a pretty standard origin story that is also kind of charming as well. The one thing I could say that is pretty much the hugest positive I can give to this film is that the character writing in here is kind of decent and well done. Like, I still remember some of the goofy lines from Green Goblin, like, the itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout, down came the goblin and took the spider out. Like, that is a good line. Like, that's a funny line. This movie also uses a lot of really good cinematography when it comes to experiencing what Spider-Man is doing in New York City. Like, remember how in Richard Donner's Superman with Christopher Reeves, how they tried to make Superman fly in the air and it won an Academy Award for its visual effects? Well, this one takes that sort of angle of like, oh, well, we see Superman fly? No, you get to experience Spider-Man swinging around New York. There are certain times in this movie where they have these shots where the camera just zooms down through a row of cars. And it's so well done, and you get to experience the ride with Spider-Man, and that is where some of the coolest aspects comes in, is the cinematography in relation to Spider-Man. Now, obviously, there is some visual effects that don't obviously pan out in this film. Some of the CGI is a bit dated, I feel, especially with Tobey Maguire jumping between buildings and looking like a rubberized sock puppet. It's kind of off that way. Now let's talk about the villain of the piece. Willem Dafoe obviously plays Norman Osborn, and I don't know how best to describe him. I mean, to be honest, he kind of operates as kind of a Power Rangers villain, but at the same time, he's also very menacing and goofy. I don't really know. I mean, granted, the only reason why I say that he kind of acts like a Power Rangers villain is because of his costume. I mean, do we really honestly believe that that looks like the Green Goblin from the comics? I mean, it's so funny. Like, to see this mask in this weird green latex bodysuit on this guy. But it's also kind of, again, it's iconic. Because, granted, I watched this as a young kid, and it always permeated my mind with the yellow glowing eyes. And it's so well, again, it's good, it's well done, it's just kind of goofy. As I could best sum up this movie as being a good first attempt, but also a bit goofy and campy. Much like every other Sam Raimi film. In every Sam Raimi film, nothing is ever really taken too seriously. There's always a hint of campiness and cheesiness in all of his films, and I feel that throughout this entire trilogy, there is that represented here, with his signature styles of camera shots, and very, very weirdly timed circumstances. It's a little bit off. Now let's get into some of the side characters. I feel one of the best side characters in this movie is Aunt May. Whenever I see Aunt May on the screen, I get this warm feeling. Every time she smiles, she gives me this nice, warm, homely, inviting feeling. And she's also a good support character for Peter as he is trying to navigate this world by himself. I mean, granted, he doesn't tell Aunt May that he's like Spider-Man or anything, that he got bit by a spider and now is shooting cobwebs out of his wrists, but Aunt May is pretty well done here. Now, J. Jonah Jameson, when it comes to iconic side characters, no one is better than J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. Like, this is perfect casting in a nutshell. This is almost as synonymous as Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. This is as synonymous as Christopher Reeve as Superman. This is one of those characters that every time I see him on the screen, I always smile. And it's such a relief. Like, every time he comes in, I'm like, oh, this is going to be an awesome scene. And he has a lot of acting chops. J.K. Simmons is one of my favorite actors of all time, and I do believe he did deserve that Oscar for Whiplash. He definitely deserves it. He knows how to get angry, and J. Jonah Jameson is that character to get angry. Now, if it is a couple characters that I think are a little bit flawed, I think Harry Osborn, played by James Franco, and Mary Jane Watson, played by Kirsten Dunst, I think both of those characters are a little bit weak, but I do think that one of them, being Harry, does get a nice little arc throughout this trilogy that I will mention more later on this week when we discuss Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. Another problem I see myself with this film is that I had a little bit of a hard time placing the time span of what this film is supposed to represent, because when we first start out, it looks like that he is still in high school, right? And then at the very end of it, he is having Thanksgiving with his family, and I don't know, maybe it's supposed to be like a 7-month span. Like, it's just too big of a span, and it probably should have been shortened it down to about 4 months. I'm just saying, I think the time span thing is a little bit too long. It probably could have been cut down just a little bit shorter. And just like every other Sam Raimi film, there is the iconic car that he always puts in every single one of his movies, especially with the Evil Dead franchise. You will never get away from this car. You will never get away from this car if you're watching a Sam Raimi film. Now, in terms of the pacing of the film, I think the film is pretty well balanced in terms of what it wants to do. It has a nice solid 30 minutes for the first act, and then you get a solid hour of the second act, which is just all build up, and like you get these little interactions between Peter Parker and Green Goblin, and they kind of square off a lot in this film, which always sets up the next bigger, badder fight that we get in this film. And then at the very end, we finally get to know that Norman Osborn is Green Goblin. Granted, we knew that throughout the entire film, but Peter Parker finally learns that the Green Goblin is Norman Osborn, someone that is close to Peter Parker and his friends, and his death in this film will greatly influence another character in the franchise that we will definitely be talking about in tomorrow's review of Spider-Man 2. All in all, I do think that this film is one of my favorite films, and the one shot in this film that really solidifies it as being one of my most iconic films to watch every year is this shot. This shot, while being very, very, pandering to the American audience, has a lot to do with what happened at 9/11. Had a lot to do with how the country was feeling at the time. And to see a movie where a hero wins over the villain and then having the final shot of the movie be Spider-Man in front of a flagpole and then flipping away is one of the most iconic shots that I will never forget. The last few minutes of this film, where you see Spider-Man swinging around the city, taking his victory lap around in this one movie, and then ending with the flag, is still memorable to this day. It is the one image that I always remember from this movie. In fact, of this entire franchise, it's one of the most iconic shots, and it's mostly memorable. It's just like with it's like with Logan and its final shot. Like, it's that memorable to me in my mind. Granted, some people may argue against how iconic that shot is. It's like, oh, well, that's just pandering and whatnot. But I think, truly, it's one of my favorite iconic shots from every single Spider-Man film, including maybe the new one. But we'll wait and see. But all in all, I do think this is one of my favorite films of all time. Sure, it has its problems, it is a bit dated, but I do think that this film stands the test of time as being one of the greatest superhero films of all time. So, with that being said, I'm going to give Spider-Man an A+. Again, I know this is not everyone's favorite Spider-Man film, but trust me, I think this is one to really look over and say, yeah, this was a cheesy time, but it was fairly enjoyable. So join me tomorrow as I cover one of cinema's most recognized Spider-Man films of all time, Spider-Man 2 from 2004, where we will spend our time with a maniacal doctor with talking robotic arms for some reason. Yep. And until next time, webheads, I will see you in the next issue. Excelsior.